Okay, and we will resume. The question is that Amendment 123 be agreed, and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. Point of order, Jenny Goldruth.
My app would not connect, Presiding Officer. I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Ms Goldruth. I'll make sure that is recorded. Point of order, First Minister.
I'd just like to check, President Officer, that I voted yes, but my app does not seem to be recording that. Right, that's okay. Sorry, there's no.
I can confirm that your vote was recorded. And the result of the vote on Amendment 123 in the name of Mary McCallan is yes 101, no 9. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. Call Amendment 124 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Already debated with Amendment 123. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved, Presiding Officer.
The question is that Amendment 124 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. Point of order, Jackie Bailey.
My app didn't refresh. I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Ms Bailey. I'll make sure that is recorded. And the result of the vote on Amendment 124 in the name of Mary McCallan is yes 103, no 8. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. We move to Group 2, Rent Conditions and Designation of Rent Control Areas. Call Amendment 125 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Group with other amendments shown in the groupings. I would point out that if Amendment 136 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 62 and Amendment 137 in the group Student Tenancies and Accommodation as a result of a preemption. And also if Amendment 64 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 270 similarly for preemption reasons. I call the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 125 and speak to the other amendments in the group. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move 125, which in my name addresses concerns about amendments that were agreed at stage 2, which require that where a local authority recommends that an area be designated as a rent control area, that area must be specified by reference to the street or ward, in addition to the existing requirement to delineate the boundary of the area on a plan. Now, I note the committee's support for that amendment, and I recognise the importance of the intention behind it, being to ensure that rent control areas are clearly defined. However, I am concerned that the current wording limits local authorities' flexibility to set boundaries in a way that best reflects local circumstances. So to address this, I have brought forward Amendment 125, which enables a local authority, where it considers appropriate, to specify the area by reference to a street, ward or appropriate boundary. I believe this approach retains the intent of Stage 2 while providing essential flexibility to councils. Amendments 126 and 127 in the name of Edward Mountain would require local authorities to submit a report where they have voluntarily undertaken an interim assessment under Section 3.2 and to do that within 3 months. Where Scottish Ministers have directed the local authority to carry out an interim assessment, this would require it to be submitted as soon as reasonably practicable, but no later than 3 months after the direction. Carrying out an assessment under Section 3.2 is entirely at the discretion of the local authority, and there is no timescale provided for completion. In terms of interim assessment carried out after directed by ministers, I think it would be very unhelpful to add such a restricted timeframe to local authorities, as it's likely to severely hinder their ability to carry out a thorough and robust process, something which I think we would all agree is essential to the proper functioning of the rent control process. As such, I can't support these amendments because I think they undermine robust assessment and reporting. Likewise, Amendment 128 in Edward Mountain's name would require ministers to consider a report from local authorities within 3 months of receipt. Whilst I agree for the need to avoid unnecessary delays in reporting, it's likely that the reporting by local authorities, which will happen on a cyclical basis, will result in the bulk of reports being received simultaneously. And it's essential that each report is scrutinised carefully to ensure that any decision to implement rent controls is clearly evidenced as being necessary and based on local data. So imposing a time limit of 3 months, particularly if all reports are received at the same time, is not a measured approach and one that I would wish to see. And as such, I can't support this amendment. Amendments 129 and 130, again by Edward Mountain, would remove the ability of ministers to specify the timing for the assessment and report when directing a local authority to carry out further assessment. Instead, they would have to submit this within 3 months. This will create, again, an unnecessary restriction, because if assessment reports contain insufficient detail for ministers to make that important, informed decision about the need for rent controls, or if we're given insufficient time to scrutinise reports, this could impact on our ability to conduct rent controls and to conduct them well. So that must be rejected. Amendment 131 in my name addresses concerns around amendments agreed at stage 2, which modified the requirement on ministers to consult before issuing guidance to local authorities on carrying out assessments of rental conditions in their area. This required ministers to consult, and I quote, persons who appear to them to understand the impact of rent increases on rural areas. Now, as a rural MSP, I recognise that circumstances in rural areas often are very different from other parts of Scotland. However, I do have concerns about this wording, because as currently drafted, the provision would be interpreted as requiring ministers to consult every person who understands the impact of rent increases on rural interests, which is clearly completely impractical. It's also not clear how these persons would be identified. It would be more extensive than, for example, the consultation that's required with other groups, such as landlords and tenants, where the requirement is to consult those who we consider to represent the interests of the group. I've therefore brought Amendment 131, which makes it clear that consultation is required with those who represent the interests of rural stakeholders. Amendment 132 in my name relates to an amendment we supported in principle at stage 2, requiring ministers to issue guidance to local authorities about reports to be prepared following their assessment of local rent conditions. This was on the basis that we would seek to amend this duty at stage 3 to allow time for consultation before any such guidance is issued, and for that reason I've brought forward Amendment 132, which sets a deadline of 9 months for issuing this guidance, beginning with the date on which the relevant provision comes into force. I'm content that this meets the intention of the Stage 2 amendment, whilst allowing that crucial time for consultation and engagement with local authorities. Moving to Amendment 133 in my name, this addresses concerns around amendments at Stage 2 that would require Scottish ministers to include in guidance to local authorities eligible reasons for recommending rent control when reporting on their conditions. Now, I agree that there is a need for clear guidance for local authorities to make their assessments and recommendations, not least to ensure a consistent approach across Scotland. And I do recognise why the committee voted in support of this at Stage 2. However, local authorities may be reluctant to recommend rent control where their reasons for doing so don't align with the eligible reasons that we would have to set out in guidance under this amendment. There is therefore a risk that this could inadvertently impact on the ability to impose rent control well where it's needed to protect tenants. It would unnecessarily fetter the discretion of the local authority, who are ultimately best placed to determine these matters. So, as we set out at stage 2, an exhaustive list would be restrictive and would not support consideration of vital local factors. And I've therefore brought Amendment 133. Moving to Amendment 134, this will provide that guidance issued under Section 7(1) may include provision about the reasons for recommending the designation of an area for rent control. And again, as compared with before, this is quite different from requiring the eligible criteria, which could be restrictive. Amendment 135 from Edward Mountain would require reports by ministers on proposals for rent control to include detailed reasons for their decisions, rather than just reasons. This doesn't create any meaningful duty on ministers beyond what's already in the bill. Oh, sorry. Apologies, Presiding Officer. I thought Mr Mountain was making an intervention.
Officer, would you take an I wonder if the Minister would take an intervention.
Well, that's what was happening before.
Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It does actually mean something detailed. It certainly means something to people outside the Parliament. So I'm not quite sure why the government would object to the word detailed instead of having nothing in there at all. Maybe if I'd put in it flimsy beforehand, you'd object to that as well.
Always through the Chair. Cabinet Secretary.
Sorry.
I certainly would reject flimsy as well as detailed. It doesn't have any legal application. All reasons specified in law have to be detailed, and therefore it needs to be rejected on that basis. My amendments 60 to 62, they address concerns with amendments agreed at stage 2, which removed ministers' discretion to designate rent control areas, instead requiring designation where that is what's recommended by a local authority. Now, this change could lead to unintended consequences, as it would oblige ministers to lay regulations to designate rent control areas even where evidence does not support the need for this, or where it may be disproportionate. I don't think that I don't think that this fits well with the evidence-led approach in the bill at introduction. These amendments are, I believe, necessary to ensure that rent control is only introduced where it's necessary and proportionate to do so. And I'll take Ms Chapman.
Maggie Chapman.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking my intervention. The changes that were made at stage 2 don't require ministers to make regulations for rent control without any other checks. They are quite clearly stipulated in Section 1A, checks to allow the ministers to say, actually, no, these aren't proportionate, these aren't appropriate. The protections are there. I don't understand, given the protections are there, to give ministers that power, why the Cabinet Secretary is trying to overrule the will of the committee at stage 2 in this way.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I can absolutely assure Ms Chapman I am in no way trying to overrule the committee's intentions. All I am trying to do is reinstate ministerial discretion as it applies in the normal way in these circumstances, just to assure Ms Chapman that the formulation of the amendment as it stands would require that ministers were obliged to implement the recommendation from the local authorities, rather than receiving the recommendation from local authorities and applying our discretion on the application of it or not. So it's for these reasons that I brought Amendment 60 to 62 to reinstate that discretion, which is simply bringing us into line with the normal way and the appropriate checks and balances that normally operate. Amendment 136, in the name of Maggie Chapman, would remove the requirement that rent control can only be designated where it's necessary and proportionate to do so. And I'm clear that we really must only designate an area for rent control if the evidence shows that it's necessary, if the evidence shows that it's proportionate, and crucially in those local circumstances. So I'm not sure on what other basis we could make a decision, and I therefore can't support this amendment. Amendment 63 in my name addresses concerns around an amendment which was agreed at stage 2 that provides that an amount specified, quote, under regulations in section 9(1), which was related to the setting of the rent cap, must be calculated by reference to the quality, state of repair and energy efficiency of a property. And I acknowledge the concerns around these factors which were raised by a number of members during discussion. I firstly want to be clear that we are committed to tackling disrepair in housing, and we are continuing to drive a culture in which good maintenance is non-negotiable. A number of measures to tackle poor quality properties in the private rented sector, including through the requirements set out in the repairing standard, are already in place under separate legislation. However, I strongly believe that those in the private rented sector should be afforded the protection of Awab's law. That's why I committed to bringing Awab's law into force across the whole of the rented sector from March next year, starting with damp and mould, subject, of course, to Parliament's agreement. Returning to the powers in Section 9 of the Bill, the Committee agreed our suite of Stage 2 amendments, which set out a uniform fixed rent cap to apply to all rent control areas. This was brought forward in response to calls for greater certainty on how rent controls will be implemented. As part of this suite of amendments, the references to, I quote, an amount specified in regulations were removed from Section 9. For the avoidance of confusion, I have therefore brought forward Amendment 63 to remove this obsolete reference, which resulted from the Stage 2 process. Getting there, Presiding Officer. Turning to Amendment 270 in Mark Griffin's name, an amendment was agreed at Stage 2 which provides a definition of, quote, rent payable that excludes utility charges from being considered as part of the rent in relation to some of the rent control provisions in the bill. Amendment 270 in Mr Griffin's name would now expand the list of exclusions in this definition to include amounts payable for broadband or district heating. Now, I do appreciate the concerns that were raised at Stage 2 about the collection of accurate data and what may be included as part of the rent for a property in order to facilitate that fair comparison of rents across the PRS. And I think this is what led members to support this amendment. However, firstly, the committee agreed our Stage 2 amendments to Section 15, which as amended now allows local authorities or the ministers to collect specific information on whether the rent payable for a property includes any costs associated with the property, what these costs are, and do all of that as part of their data gathering on rents. Secondly, the effect of, and I think this is the point that I expect will resonate with Mark Griffin because I'm sure this wasn't his intention, but the effect of excluding utilities from the definition in this part of the bill, it has the potential to create confusion in the sector because the definition inserted at Stage 2 would create a distinction between the definition of rent payable for the purposes of designating rent control on the one hand and for the definition for the operation of rent control on the other. And importantly, this would also allow any unscrupulous landlord to increase such costs for those utilities at any time and to any level out with the protections that would otherwise be afforded if it was part of the definition of rent. And I'm sure that's not what he would intend, and I'll take Megan Gallagher's intervention.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. In many rural properties, landlords supply these services via private infrastructure with no alternative provider within the area, so utility costs are often included as part of the rental charge. I think there needs to be fairness when we're looking at geography, so can the Cabinet Secretary understand that not every area will be the same, and this is why these issues have been brought to Parliament in order to create that fairness within the sector?
Cabinet Secretary.
I absolutely understand the point that Megan Gallagher puts to me, and it's something that I discussed with Scottish Land and Estates before Stage 3. And despite agreeing and understanding the different nature of the situation in rural and urban Scotland, I can't have a situation where we have a differing definition between rent payable for the designation of rent control and operation of rent control on the other hand, and I can't have a situation where utilities are taken out with the definition of rent payable and therefore can be increased out with the protections that would otherwise be afforded to the tenants. But I do commit to continuing to work with Scottish Lands and Estates and others on the nuances there. But for all the reasons I've set out, I have brought Amendment 64 to remove this confusing definition at Stage 2 so that the operation is seamless and there is continuity between definitions. And for all these reasons, I would urge members to support my amendments in this group, which I move, and to reject the amendments in the name of Edward Mountain, Maggie Chapman and Mark Griffin. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Edward Mountain to speak to Amendment 126 and other amendments in the group. Mr Mountain.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I'm just going to state on the record at the outset, and I'm sure it won't surprise anyone, that I don't like rent control areas. I think they're a blunt instrument to achieving an aim. Now, my amendments 126 to 130 were to try and get people to get a move on when they were detailing out and making reports. I don't believe 3 months is too tight a timescale. In the real world, people provide reports in a much quicker period than that. And therefore, I think it's unfair just to say 3 months is too quick, as a reason and excuse councils and the government from making decisions in that period. Now, the reason why I say that is that every month there is some dubiety. It causes problems within the rented sector and causes problems with tenants and landlords and could cause disagreement. That's why I wanted the process to be done in 3 months. I would also just maybe draw attention to the Cabinet Secretary. There may be no legal definition of detailed that she's prepared to accept, but it says in the Oxford Dictionary, which I think is always a good place to start, having many details or facts and showing attention to detail. That's what I was asking for in the report, not a big ask. I'm slightly disappointed that the Cabinet Secretary doesn't think that's a useful addition to the points that she'd made. Now, I have to say Amendments 60, 61 and 62 from the Cabinet Secretary are of concern to me, because it takes away the power from local authorities and invests it into the government. I mean, I'm not sure that that's democracy at a local level. I'm disappointed with the Cabinet Secretary moving Amendment 63. Amendment 63, let's be clear, removed an amendment that I moved at stage 2 and was accepted by the government at the committee when it was discussed. And that was to take into account the quality and state of repair of energy efficiency of a property. There is no doubt in my mind that properties that have very high standards of insulation have the highest quality furnishings, and within that property would demand a different rent to a property that did not. And therefore, it seems entirely appropriate that Amendment 63 was agreed by the committee that considered this in great detail, and it's disappointing that the government now seems to be thinks it's appropriate to wade in. Amendment 64, I'm disappointed again with the Cabinet Secretary on this, which removes the definition of rent. And I take it for the point that Megan Gallagher, presiding officer, made the point about district heating and heating infrastructure. It's not just that, of course, Cabinet Secretary. A lot of private rental properties in the rural communities have private water supplies, which are incredibly onerous to make sure that they're checked each year and maintained. And they may also have private sewage supplies. Now, if you are on those, Cabinet Secretary, I'm sure you'll know that they don't appear on your council tax bill. So therefore, it seems right and proper that the landlord should charge the equivalent amount, should they so choose, as Scottish Water do, for maintaining those adequate and wholesome supplies that we're all after them providing. And I was disappointed that by removing what was defined as rent, could mean that the rent for a property which included those would be considered to be too high. I think that's a mistake, Cabinet Secretary, and I would urge you to reflect on that. And I also have looked carefully, for the same reason, at Mark Griffin's Amendment 270, which extends exclusions for rent payable to include broadband and district heating, which I think is a sensible amendment, Cabinet Secretary, for a lot of reasons that I've just given, and I hope you'll support his and mine and leave my amendment in and not move your amendment, because it seeks to squash the committee's considered decision at stage 2. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. I now call Maggie Chapman to speak to Amendment 136 and other amendments in the group. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And Edward Mountain will be quite surprised to hear that I actually agree with virtually everything he said. Not quite all, but nearly everything, and we'll be supporting his amendments in this group. At stage 2, I was very pleased to get the committee's support to strengthen local democratic decision-making on rent controls. As a result, Section 9, as it currently stands, obliges Scottish Government to introduce rent controls where a local authority has submitted a valid application for one. Before, they could simply refuse to produce the secondary legislation to introduce a rent control area. My Amendment 136 in this group does some tidying up after this welcome change. It removes the ability of the Scottish Government to veto a rent control area application on the grounds that it's neither necessary or proportionate. But let me be clear, this does not prevent an inappropriate rent control area application from being stopped. If the Parliament is not convinced an application is necessary or proportionate, or that it is inappropriate for any other reason, then the Section 1A I amended in at stage 2 allows it to refuse. But crucially, it takes it out of the hands of a minister. It respects the rights of local authorities and respects the rights of the Scottish Parliament to oversee crucial policy decisions. The Scottish Government's Amendment 60 to 62 to remove my amendments at stage 2 is deeply troubling. Firstly, it goes back on a fairly well-established principle, I think, that the Scottish Government accepts the will of committees and of Parliament in this way. This new approach was voted through at stage 2. The legislation team has certified that the amendment then and remains technically competent. There is absolutely no reason to reverse this other than the Scottish Government does not want to give that power to local authorities. Secondly, an absolute right of veto violates the Verity House Agreement the Scottish Government is a signatory to. This agreement says the powers held by local authorities shall normally be full and exclusive. They may not be undermined or limited by another central or regional authority. Why should local councils think the agreement is worth the paper it's written on if the Scottish Government wishes to give itself a veto over one of the most important new powers for local governments in many years? I urge the Cabinet Secretary to reconsider, and I ask her to reflect on the words she used in her own remarks in Group 1 earlier this afternoon, when she talked about rent control areas needing to be locally led. Let local authorities lead. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. And I now call Mark Griffin to speak to Amendment 270 and other amendments in the group. Mr Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm speaking here in support of my Amendment 270, which will allow broadband and district heating schemes to be included in the list of services that may be supplied privately where there is no publicly available infrastructure. Now, recognising these essential services in legislation will encourage the development of more district heating networks, supporting our energy efficiency and decarbonisation goals. Future-proof the legislation for a time where heat networks become commonplace, ensuring that any charges are clearly identified and kept separate from rent. Bring clarity and consistency to how privately provided essential services are treated, especially and crucially in rural and off-grid areas where public provision is often lacking, and provide greater transparency for tenants in both service provision and in costs. Now, I'm supportive of the principle of rent control, especially given the background of ever-increasing rents and the urgent need to protect tenants. But for those rent controls to be effective and workable, it's absolutely vital that we say rent is clearly defined as rent only, with essential utilities and services like broadband and district heating identified and charged separately where appropriate. Now, this approach ensures that tenants are not paying for hidden or bundled costs, and that the system is transparent and fair for everyone. Attempts to repeal the amendment that clarified this definition risk undermining the clarity and fairness that tenants deserve. We also can't afford to lose much-needed homes from the sector, particularly in rural Scotland at this time of a housing emergency, and that's why I've tabled this, to ensure that the amendment passed at stage 2 is now future-proofed to include the wider definitions of district heating and broadband, and ask members to support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Griffin. And I call Megan Gallagher.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. If I may speak to a couple of amendments in this grouping. Similar to my colleague Edward Mountain, I am concerned about Amendments 60 and 61 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, and that falls in relation to the need for scrutiny, given the unpredictable nature of rent controls and what we have seen happen right across the country in relation to the loss of investment when rent controls have been placed in certain areas. I absolutely understand the point that Maggie Chapman is trying to make about local authorities and localism, local authorities being able to make decisions what's right in their own area. However, this is a decision that's going to impact whether more homes are built right across the country, and I think that's something that we as MSPs should be kept up to date on and will be able to scrutinise. However, it seems that the Government is going to attempt to remove that from the bill this afternoon. Amendment 136 in the name of Maggie Chapman. I was reassured to hear that the Cabinet Secretary would not be supporting this particular amendment. Again, I think that it is appropriate to have the definition for the requirement for rent controls to be necessary and proportionate. I do believe that that is the right terminology when we're looking at this particular area of the bill. We do need to look at the full picture when it comes to rent controls and make sure that decisions are fully evidence-based so that there are no unintended consequences on the rental market. And I do believe that if Maggie Chapman's amendment was passed today, the aims that she's trying to achieve, the opposite would actually be implemented on the back of this amendment. So I do think that we need to look at everything as a whole. Amendment 63 in the name of Mary McCallan. Again, I have raised the issue of fairness in terms of rent controls, looking at this bill and making sure that it is proportionate. Parliament has been waiting, of course, for the Heating Buildings Bill, and should extensive costs be associated with this bill, I do believe that landlords will find it harder to keep pace with rising costs, as rent increases would no longer be directly linked to improvements or specific features of their property. I have raised with the Cabinet Secretary, when we have met, the need to incentivise landlords to keep them in the housing market to ensure that we do have homes available for people to live in. I do believe that landlords have faced significant financial losses, and many, of course, as we know, have left the market due to temporary rent controls. So increased regulation and hostility towards landlords will not result in ensuring supply of homes meets demand. And when referencing this as an example, the report by the Scottish Association of Landlords revealed concerns that increasing regulation have led to a loss of more than 50,000 homes in the private rented sector. So the decisions that we make on this bill will have a direct impact on our housing market in the private rented sector. And if I may pick up on Amendment 64, and it was the intervention that the Cabinet Secretary took from me just moments ago. But again, when we're looking at Amendment 64, and going back to the argument that we've made in relation to rural properties and the comments that Edward Mountain have also made, I do believe that if we don't back the Amendment 270 in the name of Mark Griffin this evening, that we will be creating huge disparity between urban areas and rural areas when we're looking at the differences in terms of how rent is collated. And I think that would be again showing that this government is not standing up for these rural areas. So I do urge members this evening to back Amendment 270 in the name of Mark Griffin and not to support Amendment 64 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Gallagher. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary to wind up.
Presiding Officer, despite the time constraints, I am going to take a bit of time to wind up on this because there's some really important provisions in this section, and I really want to appeal to members to think very carefully about these, which I know they will. There have been decisions taken in this bill in the past which have proven to be the wrong decisions to take, and I would ask them to think very carefully, firstly in respect of 60, 61 and 62 in respect of rent control. This is an absolutely critical provision about when rent control will or will not come into play in Scotland. I first of all have to say that the application of rent control is not a power for local authorities, it's a power for Scottish ministers with parliamentary scrutiny. So Maggie Chapman's formulation of ministers having a veto over local authorities' powers, that is completely wrong. The effect of Ms Chapman's amendment would be that ministers were forced to designate a rent control area, not a small action, but forced to designate a rent control area even where we considered it to be disproportionate. And we would be in that position because a very unusual constitutional approach had been taken to the formulation of the power that was passed by Maggie Chapman at stage 2. And I would ask Maggie Chapman to consider the situation, perhaps, where a local authority is ideologically or politically against rent controls. That would prevent ministers having any say on whether rent controls were in place in that local authority. Similarly, I might ask those more sceptical about rent control to consider the effect if a council was disproportionately seeking to apply a rent control. Members who don't vote for 60, 61 and 62 will be completely taking out the Scottish Government's role in assessing the proportionality of that, and I would ask them to think extremely carefully about doing so. Yeah, I absolutely will.
Megan Gallagher.
Does this not highlight the problems with rent controls in its entirety? The fact that we're arguing whether or not it should lay with the Scottish Government, it should lay with local councils and the political make-up and political ideologies. This is showing that rent controls are going to have an impact on the sector, and regardless of which way members vote this evening, there's going to be problems with rent controls.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm afraid there's no way of backing out of this about regardless of the way members vote. The way that members vote on this particular issue will have considerable impact to the operation of rent controls in Scotland. They are being taken forward. They are the right thing to do where the evidence suggests it's the case in the local area, where the local authority has gathered that information and referred it to the ministers, and where ministers have made our assessment that it is proportionate to accept it. So I have to stress again the vital importance of 60, 61 and 62 being considered very carefully by members across the chamber. Similarly, with rent payable and the definition there, I have to stress again to members that the effect of not voting for 64 will be that in a rent control area, utility payments will be able to be raised, perhaps exorbitantly, by landlords out with the controls that would otherwise apply to rent. And again, members have to think very carefully about that. I will take the
Edward Mountain.
I may have jumped the gun a bit, and the Cabinet Secretary may be about to tell me that she believes that things such as private water supplies and also private drainage ought to be considered. But by taking out the definition, is she not creating more problems? Should she have not taken a sensible approach to this and defined what rent could be, what could be included in rent, rather than just saying what can't be?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the definitions of rent are clear, and what was done at stage 2 was that they were separated. What I'm saying is we need to undo that separation, because one of the effects of that is that in a rent control area, a tenant will not be afforded protections for utilities that they would otherwise be afforded to rent. And I just ask members to think very carefully about how they vote on that question as well as 61, 60 and 62.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The question is therefore that Amendment 125 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is agreed. I now call amendments 126, 127, 128, 129 and 130, all in the name of Edward Mountain and all previously debated with Amendment 125. I would invite Edward Mountain to move amendments 126 to 130 en bloc.
Sorry, I was confused by the red light coming on before you'd finished speaking, Presiding Officer. I'm sure you weren't enticing me to do that. Yes, moved en bloc, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. Does any member object to a single question being put on amendments 126 to 130? No member objects. The question is therefore that amendments 126 to 130 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. So you would vote, actually,
they're voting on all of them.
all of them. But what if you agreed to one?
Well, if they,
You should have. They should have asked.
Yeah. So if you,
They should. The vote is now closed. Point of order, Angus Robertson.
My apologies, I couldn't connect to the app. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Your vote will be recorded. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 126 to 130 en bloc in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 32, no 77. There was one abstention. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call amendments 131, 132, 133 and 134, all in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and all previously debated with Amendment 125. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move amendments 131 to 134 en bloc.
En bloc.
Thank you. Does any member object to a single question being put on amendments 131 to 134? No member objects. The question is therefore that amendments 131 to 134 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is agreed. I call amendment 135 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 125. Edward Mountain, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 135 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Point of order, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I don't think I connected there. I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Mr Fraser. Your vote will be recorded. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 135 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 51, no 59. There was one abstention. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call amendment 60 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with amendment 125. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Formally moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 60 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 60 in the name of Mary McCallan is yes 78, no 32. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. I now call amendment 61 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with amendment 125. Cabinet Secretary to move formally. Thank you. The question is that amendment 61 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 61 in the name of Mary McCallan is yes 77, no 33. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. I now call amendment 136 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 125. I remind members that if amendment 136 is agreed to, I cannot call amendment 62 and 137 by way of preemption. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 136 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. I therefore call I therefore call a division, and members should cast their vote now.
So if it's agreed to move, so we have to do the division on it first.
The vote is now closed. Point of order, Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I tried to vote no, but it went as a yes. I just want to check my vote is recorded properly.
Ms Boyack, what I can say is that the vote will be as you vote. The record will show how you voted.
Can I clarify? I initially did that and double-checked and then did vote no, and it would not let me go from yes to no within the time of the vote. So I think that's important to log. I did actually try and vote no.
All I can say at this point, Ms Boyack, is the vote is recorded as a yes, and that is the process. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 136 in the name of Maggie Chapman is yes 8, no 101. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 62 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with amendment 125. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Formally moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 62 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division, and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Point of order, Sarah Boyack.
Thank you. I refreshed the app and it wouldn't let me vote, and I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Ms Moya. Your vote will be recorded. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 62 in the name of Mary McCallan is yes 78, no 32. There are no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. I call amendment 137 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with amendment 123. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Formally moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 137 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The Parliament is agreed. No, a late no there. I would ask members to try and follow the process as we do it, or speak perhaps more loudly because I didn't hear the member say that. The Parliament is not agreed and there will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 137 in the name of Mary McCallan is yes 103, no 0. There were 7 abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. I now call amendment 63 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with amendment 125. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 63 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Point of order, Katie Clark.
I would have voted no.
Thank you, Ms Clark. Your vote will be recorded. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 63 in the name of Mary McCallan is yes 58, no 51. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. I now call amendment 64 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with amendment 125. I remind members that if Amendment 64 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 270 by way of preemption. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 64 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 64 in the name of Mary McCallan is yes 59, no 52. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. And as I had previously indicated, on the basis that that amendment has been agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 270 by way of preemption. I therefore turn to the next group, which is Group 3 on exempt properties. I call Amendment 138 in the name of Maggie Chapman, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. I draw members' attention to the procedural notes on amendments in this group, as set out in the groupings. And I call on Maggie Chapman to move Amendment 138 and speak to all amendments in the group. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move Amendment 138 in my name. Greens oppose exemptions from rent control. To work for renters and to work for landlords, the system needs to be simple and transparent. Adding various exemptions for different types of landlords or different types of properties will make the system excessively complicated. Many renters are already not familiar with their rights. Bringing in a system of rent controls but taking it away again for significant numbers of tenants will only add to the confusion and the problem. We do not believe that there should be wide-ranging scope for exemptions. Renters need clarity. Landlords should not be able to weasel their way out of rent controls. My amendments in this group remove exemption provisions. But if I can say just a little bit about two specific areas that I know are much talked about. Specifically, we cannot... Yes.
Willie Rennie.
Just regret some of the language that's been used in this debate about landlords and investors in properties. To use the word weasel out of a control, I think is unfortunate, because we cannot solve this housing crisis without everybody being involved, whether it's the state through councils, RSLs, charities, but also the private sector. So to describe them as weaselling out, I think is exactly the kind of problem that we've got ourselves into by deterring investment. So let's please tone down the language and respect everybody who's got a role to play in investing in properties.
Michael Chapman.
I thank Willie Rennie for his intervention. He will not be surprised to know that I disagree, and I think that the hundreds of tenants and renters and activists who were gathered outside Parliament last night would echo the concerns. Rogue landlords have got away with really poor practice for far too long. And that is why, Presiding Officer, if I can say specifically on two areas, we cannot support exemptions for build to rent. This is seen by many as a way to increase private investment in housing supply, and it's attractive to investors if they can be sure of high rental yields. However, because of that requirement for high rental yields, it tends to be high-end luxury housing, or at least priced at the higher end of the private renter sector. Such developments do not sit well with the desire for mixed communities or for an affordable element of large-scale housing developments. From a Green point of view, there is no reason, in principle, why a build-to-rent landlord should be given an exemption from rent controls. Yes.
Kevin Stewart.
I would suggest that Ms Chapman and colleagues may wish to visit some of the build-to-rent developments in the likes of Liverpool, which have been built by very socially aware companies and are mixed housing, including semi-detached and detached homes. Again, I don't think we should be painting everyone with the same brush here, and that's the kind of investment that I would welcome in Scotland.
Maggie Chapman.
I thank Kevin Stewart for that intervention. And again, we disagree. The experience that renters tell us when they are looking to rent in properties that have been supported by build-to-rent schemes, they are high-end, they are expensive, they do not sit well with that desire for mixed community living. So, from our point of view, there's no reason, in principle, why a build-to-rent landlord should be given exemption from rent control area controls. No reason, in principle, why a build-to-rent tenant should not have the same package of tenancy protections as any other tenant. This is about consistency for tenants, regardless of the type of property they live in. The argument for the exemption only holds if build-to-rent is seen as a positive form of housing development compared with other types. We do not contend that it has such a positive view across the board. We also cannot support exemptions for mid-market rent. Even so-called mid-market levels are unaffordable to many. The Scottish Government's own housing strategy identifies inconsistency with how mid-market rents actually reflect affordability. We remain concerned that investment in mid-market rent would cause it to grow at the expense of genuinely affordable homes, like in the social renter sector. This won't help us tackle the housing emergency or our homelessness crisis. Exempting mid-market rent from rent controls would only exacerbate these crises we face. We need clarity. Tenants, renters need clarity. A no exemption principle provides that clarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I now call the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 65 and other amendments in the group. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My amendments 65 to 70 and 122 would provide the Scottish Ministers with the power to set a process by which a property is confirmed as an exempt property. The intent of this is to enable tenants to be notified about the exempt status of a property and to verify that a property is exempt from rent control. This is important to ensuring tenants are protected from attempts to circumvent any rent control measures in the bill, and it's also important for landlords to have absolute assurance on their status. Now, as part of our consultation, we asked questions about what this process might look like. My amendment would give ministers the power to set out this process in regulations once we've had the opportunity to fully consider the responses to our consultation from across the sector, and I would ask members to support these amendments. Turning to Maggie Chapman's amendments 138, 153, 154, 156, 157, 163, 164, 172, 267, 268 and 269. These amendments would together remove any possibility of properties being exempted from rent control measures in the bill, and I think Maggie Chapman has been quite clear that that was her intention. She doesn't support exemptions. To move through them, Amendment 157 would remove the power of the Scottish Ministers to define by regulations properties which are exempt, and others would variously remove references to exempt properties. Now, the removal of this property would make it impossible to exempt any private rental property from rent control, something considered key to ensuring that there can be a balanced regime of controls. Removing this power would impact on the ability of the Scottish Ministers to impose rent control at all, because we must be able to demonstrate that it can be done in a necessary and a proportionate manner that balances the property rights of landlords with protections for tenants. Amendment 164 removes references to exempt properties from modifications to the 2016 Act, determining the application of rent controls to private residential tenancies. And this substantially alters the application of rent controls so as to capture every private residential tenancy in a rent control area without exception. Now, I fully acknowledge Maggie Chapman's opposition to rent controls, but I simply cannot support these amendments. It is crucial that we carefully define the scope of our exemptions that we bring forward so that they can serve their intended purpose, balancing those rights of landlord and tenants, And this work is exactly what we will continue to do with stakeholders, refining definitions over the coming month with a view to introducing regulations, subject of course to parliamentary approval, after royal assent. At stage 2, a number of amendments have been brought forward seeking to stipulate that regulations include specific exemptions from rent control. Before I turn to other amendments in this group, I just want to confirm something which I've already set out, that it is my intention that, where appropriate, mid-market rent properties and build-to-rent properties will be exempt from rent control measures in the bill. In light of the housing emergency, it is absolutely vital that we prioritise expanding housing stock in Scotland, and exempting certain categories of properties will support supply in these areas. Our recent consultation included questions on how mid-market rent and new properties built for rent should be defined in any exemption. These are not straightforward matters. We are still considering these issues, and the responses that we have received from across the sector. Yes, I will.
John Mason.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. I have quite a lot of mid-market rent in my sector and in my constituency, and constituents are contacting me about the huge amount of increase that they're facing. It's not just inflation, it's a lot more than that. How can she deal with that?
Cabinet Secretary.
I understand that within the affordable sector we have social homes, we have mid-market homes, and that rents may increase in mid-market rent. But let's remember that to a large extent this is about the social landlord using rent to drive improvements in the existing stock and expansion of stock. And I have to say that we need only look at the statistics on homelessness and the strain in supply and demand in housing in Scotland just now to know that we can't take action which is going to stifle investment in all tenures of housing across Scotland. Turning to Amendment 158 in the name of Graham Simpson, this would require any regulations to define an exempt property to include a specific exemption for build-to-rent property as defined in the amendment. Likewise, Graham Simpson's Amendment 159 would require any regulations to define an exempt property to include a specific exemption for properties where the rent payable is less than half the open market rent and where the landlord has incurred significant costs to improve and repair the property. Now, the drafting of this amendment would not function so as to provide a power on the Scottish Ministers to define, I quote, open market rent or, quote, significant costs for the purposes of the regulations, and it's not clear how this amendment would operate without these definitions being clearly set out. Graham Simpson's Amendment 160 would require any regulations to define an exempt property to include a specific exemption for property which the landlord is a registered social landlord or a subsidiary of a registered social landlord. Amendment 161 in the name of Edward Mountain would require any regulations to define an exempt property to include a specific exemption for any property where there is an employee of the landlord and the rent is below the market rate. Now, there's no definition included of what's meant by market rate or how it would be determined what the market rate is, so it's unclear how this exemption would operate. It's also not clear how or why a tenant who happens to be an employee ought not to be afforded protections. However, I want to be clear, I am keen to ensure that the circumstances of individual landlords be taken into account. And as part of delivering a system of rent controls that's capable of balancing interests of tenants with landlords, the bill includes regulation-making powers to allow for rent increases above the cap where that's necessary to achieve such balance. However, like in other exemptions, it's essential that the decisions in relation to this are informed by full and open consultation, allowing all of those who may be affected by rent control to have their say. And for this reason, our recent consultation included specific questions about where landlords have consistently charged a rent that's below the market rates or has made significant improvements to the let property, as well as other questions on when a rent increase above the cap may be appropriate. Analysis of the consultation response is still ongoing. However, my view is, in principle, that I am minded to take forward the possibility of regulations that would allow for such increases where the rent has been consistently held below market rent, or where there has been investment in improvements to the quality of the rented property where this is appropriate. Further work and engagement with stakeholders will be necessary to consider the detail of where and in what circumstances such exceptions may be appropriate and how they could define, and I look forward to working with stakeholders on that. However, as I've said, it's crucial that we consider those responses and always seek to take a balanced and informed approach. Megan Gallagher's Amendment 278 would require any regulations to define an exempt property to include specific exemptions for any property for as long as works are being undertaken by the landlord to eliminate or mitigate risks connected with building materials, including cladding and rack. Now, it's not clear from this amendment as to how direct or indirect the risks to human life, as it's put, are to be measured. And I suppose it's concerning that this amendment would allow rent increases to open market rates in buildings where there's a risk to the tenant's life. It's also not clear that this would necessarily offer benefit to landlords, as the exemption would only appear to apply for the duration of any works, which may not align with the point at which rent can be increased. And for these reasons, I can't support this amendment. Presiding Officer, moving on as quickly as I can, Megan Gallagher's Amendment 279 would require any regulations to define an exempt property to include specific exemptions for the duration of time the landlord is taking steps to improve the EPC rating from less than C to C or above. This would exempt from rent control properties where the landlord is taking action to improve the EPC rating. And the amendment does not specify what would constitute action to improve that rating or why it would be reasonable to exempt the property from controls for the entire duration of that action, which does not appear to be limited in any way. So it's not clear that this would necessarily offer benefit to tenant or landlord, and I can't support it. As I've set out, I believe that any exemptions should be in regulation. They should have been consulted on, and I can't support anything which does not pursue that. Finally, Edward Mountain's Amendment 162 would require Scottish ministers to lay draft regulations setting properties exempt from rent control within 6 months of the Housing Scotland Act 25 receiving royal assent. As I've said, I agree that it's vital to give certainty, and I intend to do that as soon as possible. I have already committed to bringing forward secondary legislation on these matters at the earliest opportunity following royal assent. But I'm sure all members would agree that it's critical we get this absolutely right and that those affected have a chance to have their say. Allowing time to consult on the regulations is necessary, and I don't consider that setting a legislative timetable is the best way to achieve this. And I'll leave it there, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I would advise the Chamber that as we are nearing the agreed time limit, under Rule 9.8.4a, open brackets, small c, close brackets, I consider it necessary to allow the debate on this group to continue beyond the limit in order to avoid the debate being unreasonably curtailed. And with that, I call Graham Simpson to speak to Amendment 158 and other amendments in the group. Mr Simpson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, we've already heard that at stage 2 I moved an amendment which would have included purpose-built student accommodation in rent control arrangements. Now, for anyone that was at the committee meeting and anyone who was watching, it would have been perfectly obvious that I did that merely as a tactic to get the government to the table. And to some degree, that has worked. But it did cause quite a hullabaloo. The Cabinet Secretary has successfully reversed that position. But that now leaves us in the position where PBSA is exempt from rent controls, but build-to-rent and mid-market rent properties are not. And that was the government's original position. That's what they wanted. But it would just mean that investment would go, if it stays like that, investment will go into student flats and not the other sectors. So that, to me, is a completely incoherent position. Now, the new Cabinet Secretary has said she agrees that build-to-rent and mid-market rent properties should be exempt. That's good. My amendments 158 and 160 should therefore make her very happy indeed. But she's already argued that we don't, after all, need anything in primary legislation. She can consult instead. The government loves to consult, and who knows, maybe there'll be a pilot or a task force if we're lucky. And I can't help thinking that if she laid the amendments ahead of me, her thinking might have been different. The sector is strongly in favour of Amendment 160. Here's what the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations had to say. I'm going to quote them. "We have consistently called for mid-market rent homes to be excluded from private sector rent controls under the Housing Bill. We're therefore pleased that the Scottish Government announced their intention to do so in the Housing Emergency Action Plan. This mirrors what the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee have already called for, as well as the Housing Investment Task Force. However, to provide certainty as soon as practically possible, we would like to see an exemption for MMR on the face of the bill." Certainty, that's a word that the Cabinet Secretary has used several times already today. They go on. "We're already seeing less MMR development among our members due to the uncertainty caused by the potential introduction of further regulation and its impact on investor confidence. MMR rents rise slower than typical PRS rents, and our sector does not raise rents above the levels required for business planning and viability. We are therefore strongly in favour of Amendment 160. And that's a position backed by the Glasgow and West Scotland Forum of Housing Associations. They want to see this on the face of the bill, quotes, "in case there is a change of approach, for example, from a new government next year." So Amendment 160 has the backing of the people in the sector, the people on the ground. And I know that nobody's actually listening to this, but they should listen to the people in the sector. And actually urge Mr Rennie, I know Mr Rennie will be listening to this, I'm sure. I'm sure he will back these amendments. Now, Amendment 159 deals with another issue that I raised at stage 2, and that is where a landlord has been charging below market rent or where they've incurred significant costs to improve a property. And in both those cases, I think they should be able to have exemption from rent controls. So it's news to me that the Cabinet Secretary thinks there is a drafting issue with that amendment. She had time to raise that with me, but that's the first I've heard of it, and that is a disappointment. Now, Megan Gallagher's amendments 278 on cladding and 279 on meeting EPC regulations deal with broadly similar themes, and she'll have my support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. I now call Edward Mountain to speak to Amendment 161 and other members in the group. Mr Mountain.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And just to disprove something that Maggie Chapman said to the Chamber earlier about weaselling out as a landlord by exempting properties, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it through cunning and deceit. I'm doing it quite openly, and that's what Amendment 161 is doing. That means that tenants who are employees of the landlord, whose rent are below the market rent, would be exempt from rent controls. Now, the reason why I'm making this point, and I'm interested to hear the Cabinet Secretary's response to this, is she'll be aware of the Agricultural Wages Board order and how much you can charge for properties that are supplied to people who are agricultural workers. And it is a very low market rent. And there may be times when the shift of their employment goes from one property to another, and therefore it might be appropriate to increase the rent because they're no longer in one place, i.e. they were given a reduced rent for working full-time on a farm. So that's the aim of that objective, and also the aim is also to ensure that other people who are given properties that require them, and the only reason they can get exemption from getting benefits in kind, their work requires them to be in location, will probably end up with a property with a very low market rent. Should that position change and they were within a rent control area, there would be restrictions on how much the rent could be increased. And I'm just asking the Cabinet Secretary to consider that and maybe talk to that when she comes to summing up. As far as Amendment 162 is concerned, listen, I have throughout this, Presiding Officer, made the point that when there is uncertainty in the market, the market reacts to it. So I'm trying to get the Cabinet Secretary, by this amendment, to make draft regulations within 6 months, purely because the Cabinet Secretary is seeing this legislation through, and it might not be the Cabinet Secretary who's in a position to lay those draft regulations. Or you think it will be, Cabinet Secretary? Let's wait till the election. Let's wait till the people of Scotland decide. We'll then can make comments. Sorry, I could wait to Mr Day if he wants to, Presiding Officer.
I don't think Mr Day seeks to intervene, but could I ask members, please, to let the member who's got the floor carry on? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So all I'm trying to do in this is get the draft regulations laid early. I agree with the Cabinet Secretary amendment about if 155, where if a property is advertised, that it should be declared if it's exempt. There are a couple of things that I would just say in here, and I think Megan Gallagher, Presiding Officer, still got to speak to her amendments, but I think the point that I'd be interested to hear is often when properties are taken on where there are substantial works required, i.e. works for EPCs and removing of rocky concrete, that the rent will be at a reduced level. And if they were in a rent control area, once that work had been completed, and also the property brought up to a much higher standard, there would be limits on how much the rent could be increased. And that causes me concern, because it is this government and it is this Parliament that is saying to people and landlords across Scotland that you must improve the condition of your rental properties, and therefore not to allow them to put the rent up once they've completed the work, if it was at a low rent while the work was being taken out, would actually be self-defeating. Those are the points, Presiding Officer, and I look forward to hearing from the Cabinet Secretary and from Megan Gallagher when she makes her points on her amendments.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. I now call Megan Gallagher to speak to Amendment 278 and other amendments in the group. Ms Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And on the point where Edward Mountain left off, my amendments 278 and 278 and 279, although probing amendments, I think raise incredibly important points, because I have brought forward this amendment today. I did bring the amendment forward at stage 2. However, there are still a lot of landlords right up and down the country who are facing a great deal of uncertainty in relation to the properties that they own that have combustible cladding or rack. And like many homeowners, but many of which that we have discussed in this very chamber, are in limbo whether or not the government is going to be able to provide any support, whether that be financial support, remuneration, because, again, there's a lot of people left in limbo in terms of what they can do in order to remediate or fix the properties that they own. So with that, I brought forward the amendment because Edward Mountain is absolutely correct. Usually when works are being undertaken, rent is lowered should there be a tenant living within the property, and again, should that rent control be brought into the area, there will be limited ways in which the landlord could therefore bring that rent back up to market value. So my amendment was seeking to probe the government into how they seek to look into this issue further, should it arise if this bill passes as a whole at stage 3. And similarly, when we're looking at the energy efficiency of a property, again, we are waiting a heat and buildings bill to this Parliament. We don't know what that heat and buildings bill is going to contain. I am concerned that there's going to be costs associated to landlords in relation to bring their properties up to a certain standard. I'm assuming that standard will be set out in that piece of legislation. However, again, the government's got to understand the costs that are associated with that, particularly for landlords within rural areas, because as it stands, and if you look at APC ratings just now, for landlords particularly in rural areas with more complex properties, if we can describe the properties as such, it is more expensive for them to bring their properties up to EPC or above. So again, it's something that absolutely should be considered. If I can touch upon amendments 156 and 157 in the name of Maggie Chapman, removing exemptions would be a disaster for the housing industry, and that's especially for future investment opportunities. We are in a housing emergency. This is something that the full Parliament has agreed upon in terms of what we need to do, and the solution to getting us out of the housing emergency is to build more homes. But if we bring forward legislation and vote through legislation in this chamber that stops those investment opportunities coming through, more homes being built, then we are not going to address the problems that we've all agreed are taking place right up and down the country. I think clarity over exemptions to rent controls is essential to make sure that we are protecting the rental supply of housing, and that's given the diverse nature of the private rented sector. I think when we look at landlords, of course, you have just 2 seconds till I finish this point. Landlords, of course, are not as often characterised, and again, as we've heard this afternoon, some unfortunate language surrounding landlords. Sometimes you have accidental landlords, you have landlords with a single property that are not often, with the intent of letting to self-employed individuals or holding a property as part of a pension. So this gives you the full landscape in terms of what forms, what creates a landlord, and that's why we need to look at these exemptions carefully. But on that point, I will give way to John Mason.
John Mason.
Yeah, thank you, Member. And I thank you for giving way, and I agree with her that we need more housing, but would she accept there's not much point having new housing if people can't afford to rent it?
Megan Gallagher.
I hope John Mason would agree with me that in order to lower rents, we need to build more homes so we have more supply that meets the demand that we have in the country. This is the only way we are going to get out of the housing emergency, and we've got to seriously learn what we need in terms of different housing tenures in order to match the stock that we need for houses right up and down the area. And I know how diverse all these communities are. But OK, we'll have a debate. One more point.
John Mason.
I thank her for being generous. Yeah, I don't want to extend it too long, but I mean, if her aim is to lower rent, but that implies that rent is too high at the moment. And it may be too high because there's not enough housing. I accept that. But she seems to be saying that the rent's too high at the moment.
Megan Gallagher.
Well, John Mason has not pointed out what he determines as high rent. What I'm simply saying, if we want to drive rent down, we've got to make sure that there's more ample supply of mixed housing tenure right up and down the country. I think that's a very sensible point. It's a pragmatic point, and it's also a point that explains the housing economy more generally. And I hope that would be something that John Mason would look at in terms of within his own area, in terms of his own housing demands, in terms of how many people are perhaps looking for mid-market rent property or looking for social housing, which we also know are, in terms of housing waiting lists, are incredibly high. So I hope that explains the position that I'm trying to lay out to John Mason. I have got more amendments, Mr Greer. I hope that we can have a future debate when it comes to other sections. If I can come back to the point of removing exemptions just now, I have got no idea how we are going to get out of this housing emergency if we don't build more homes. And I do welcome the announcement of MMR and BTR being confirmed as rent control exemptions. And I would hope that Maggie Chapman would also welcome this, even if it is just from the sole point of we need those homes to tackle the housing emergency. However, I do understand that the Greens have quite defined stances on exemptions and rent controls as a whole. If I can touch upon amendments 158 and to 160 in the name of Graham Simpson. Graham Simpson will of course be aware that the Scottish Conservatives support these exemptions to rent controls, and we would of course prefer to see them on the face of the bill. However, I think given that the Scottish Government have announced that MMR BTR will be exempt from rent controls once secondary legislation has been approved, I would hope that through the debate this afternoon and going into future days, as this bill has been planned over several days, I hope that we can try and tease out of the Government perhaps what further exemptions could be included as part of the consultation process, because it's hugely important that we provide that certainty and that clarity. And if I can, Presiding Officer, finish on a point, I think we've got to be incredibly careful in terms of what we are putting on the face of the bill this evening. I think it's important that we have debates surrounding exemptions. I think it's also important to note that if we put some in and we don't put others in, we could be harming investment opportunities and we could be harming the people that we're trying to help as part of this bill as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Willie Rennie.
I get really depressed when I meet my constituents who are desperate for a home, and I'm fed up with this Parliament not being able to deliver an environment which incentivises investment and encourages the construction of more homes. And that's why I think it's really important that we get the exemptions criteria right, because I want more homes built. And to do that, we need everyone. We need RSLs, we need councils, we need charities, we need those in the private rented sector, institutional investors, we need everyone. And we must consider them as partners and not the enemy. We must work together to make this work. Now, we saw that what happened with the emergency rent cap, with mid-market rent, was not exempt as the social landlords went with the social homes. And the result was there was a massive decline in investment from housing associations in mid-market rents. And not everybody can get into a social home because they won't have enough points, they won't be of sufficient housing need in order to get into those properties. So we need to have others that are of an affordable rent within their community. So we need housing associations to use the opportunity to invest. So we do agree, I think, we should agree, that there needs to be exemptions for mid-market rent for those properties in housing associations. And if we agree that as an exemption, we need to consider what other type of exemptions would be appropriate as well. So it's not whether we have exemptions, because we saw what happens if we don't have an exemption for mid-market rent in housing associations. The issue is what types and how do we do it? Now, I brought forward amendments at stage 2 at committee. I wanted it on the face of the bill. I wanted it for build-to-rent, for mid-market rent, and for those landlords that invest significantly in their properties, for them to have an exemption for a certain period of time so they can recoup that investment. And I thought that was quite reasonable. But I was persuaded by the Minister at the time, the Cabinet Secretary, when she was before the committee, that the best way of doing this was through consultation leading to regulation. And the reason for that was that we wanted it to be legally robust, because this is an area that could be legally challenged. So we need to have it as robust as we possibly can. And secondly, we need flexibility, because we will need to learn as we progress with this. We'll need to understand what exemptions work in which particular ways. And putting in regulation allows us to have flexibility to put in different types of exemptions, or maybe take certain ones out as we progress and as we learn. So I'm persuaded by the need to have consultation and regulation rather than putting on the face of the bill. Now, I agree with Graham Simpson. I agree with everything that he said, other than the process for doing it. If we proceed with his method of doing so, I think there is a danger we'll have a rigid system that is perhaps not legally robust. I'll take an intervention.
Graham Simpson.
Can I thank Willie Rennie for taking the intervention? And I hear what he's saying, but he was arguing for this to be on the face of the bill at stage 2. And I actually think he agrees with me that it should be on the face of the bill. My question to Willie Rennie would be, I read out words from the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, and they want, particularly Amendment 160, to be on the face of the bill. Because, as they point out, things can change, governments can change. We might have a change of government next year. Some of us hope there will be. The other point I would make to Willie Rennie and the Chamber, and Willie Rennie knows this fine well, if we leave things to regulations, there is less scrutiny. Parliament just doesn't have a chance to shape things as it can at this point. Thank you.
Willie Rennie.
As always, these are very fair points that Graham Simpson's making. This is about a balancing act between the different ways of doing this. And I would love to have had it on the face of the bill. I would love to be absolutely certain that this would last forever, that we'd had a consultation well in advance, so it was the stage 1 report by the committee could fully look at this. But we know that this policy has evolved over time, that the government has changed its approach midstream, and I think that's welcomed. But the result of that is that we're ending up having to play a bit of catch-up. We're having to do a consultation in order to consider regulation. Regulation does have that advantage of having flexibility over time as we learn, but I fully accept what he says. I was doing probing amendments at stage 2 to try and get the government to tell us a little bit more, which the Minister now has, when she gave her statement to the Parliament at the start of this session. And she made it very clear that mid-market rents and build-to-rent will be excluded, and I take her word at that. This area is complicated, though. we'll need to consider how this runs in the long term and what particular areas of investment I would like to see would work in practice, for how long, how much, what types of investment would be required to meet the qualifications. So I think it's appropriate that that's done through consultation and then brought through regulation. So I would urge the Chamber to support the Government's approach on this, to go through consultation and then regulation in order to get this right for the longer term.
Thank you. Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. But I'll be brief since I don't have an amendment in this group. I did want to talk to the principle of exemptions. At stage one, we had two big concerns around clarity within the bill. One was on how rent controls would operate, and that was settled at stage two. And the second was on exemptions, particularly when we have a housing bill in the middle of the context of a housing emergency. You know, I had a real concern that we had a housing bill that didn't contribute to the building of a single house. But actually, if we didn't develop this work around exemptions, what we could have had would have been a housing bill which actually led to fewer houses being built in a housing emergency than ordinarily would have done. So I just want to speak briefly on this subject to say I support the work that the Government's done and others, stakeholders, have done when it comes to exemptions on MMR particularly, but also build to rent and other areas of construction and expansion in the housing stock that we could see that we otherwise wouldn't if there wasn't the work done on exemptions in the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Maggie Chapman to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 138.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We believe that all renters should have the same rights, protections and securities, regardless of the type of property they live in. That is the principle which underpins our position on exemptions. I've spoken already about the specific types of properties, especially build-to-rent and mid-market rent. But I also want to stress that exempting properties from rent controls that do not meet basic standards for healthy living really sends out the wrong message. Landlords who don't maintain their properties or take far too long to remedy serious issues should not be rewarded with the ability to hike rents. Now, I appreciate the Scottish Green view as a minority view in this chamber, even if it is the same as the view of Living Rent and other tenant campaign groups. So I don't expect my amendments to pass this afternoon, but I will engage closely on the forthcoming discussions about exemption regulations. We must make sure that renters, their rights and their ability to live safely and securely are at the heart of these regulations. Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move that amendment in my name.
Thank you. I remind members that if Amendment 138 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 65 due to a preemption. The question is that Amendment 138 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 138 in the name of Maggie Chapman is yes, 8 no. 103. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And I call Amendment 65 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 138. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 65 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. I call Richard Leonard for a point of order.
Thank you. My yes button wouldn't work, but I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Mr Leonard. We'll ensure that's recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 65 in the name of Mary McCallan is yes 103, no 1. There were 7 abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. I am now going to suggest that we have a comfort break, colleagues, for 15 minutes. And I'd be grateful if members could be back into the chamber just before 17:40. Thank you.